years to parole. So I started doing my time. I tried my appeals. My appeals failed. In 1986, I was brought back into court again and was tried as a sexually dangerous person, which there are 3 things to become a sexually dangerous person: denial of crimes, multiple crimes, and violence. I had all 3 covered. So they sentenced me to 1 day to natural life. They never had to let me out of prison. In 1993, I saw on Phil Donahue that they had the Innocence Project. So I wrote them a letter, and they started looking for evidence, and they couldn't find the evidence because the clerks wouldn't help them, or they said it was destroyed, but they had no records of it being destroyed. And so they just filed a motion for DNA testing in front of the judge who sentenced me, who denied it without a hearing. And so I was devastated then. Then a reporter from the Boston Globe named John Ellerman came in and interviewed me for an article he was doing on DNA cases and exonerations and things like that. So he interviewed me, Benjamin Laguerre, and Rodriguez Charles. He did the article on Rodriguez Charles and Benjamin Laguerre, but he told me that the Judge Barton, was retiring in 6 months. What came out of the article was Benjamin Laguerre had a perfect DNA match, Rodriguez Charles was proven innocent through DNA, and my judge retired. The day he retired, I called the Innocence Project and asked them for help again. The student said, I really shouldn't take this call, but I'm going to take it anyways. He says, why don't you contact the New England Innocence Project, which is at Tester, Hurwitz, and Tebow, which was a law firm in Boston, and talk to them. He said, I'll send what information we have to them to help them out. And so I started the process of, I wrote them a letter, and then I sent them, they sent me back forms to fill out. I filled out those forms. And then they said, do you have the transcript? So I sent them all the transcripts. And then I believe it was, I'm not sure when it was, probably November or December of 2000, they came to see me and told me that they were representing me. I was walking back to the block from work, and the block officer says, Maher, you have an attorney with you? I said, I don't have an attorney. He says, well, you must now. So I go up to see Elisa and Karen Burns, and now I haven't had a lawyer in forever, and now I have a lawyer. So, and now they're going to, I have the Innocence Project representing me, and they're going to do DNA testing. And the first thing she says to me is, who's the cop in the trap? I says, I don't know why. She says, well, he asked me who I was and where I was from. So I says, you know, Lisa Kaplan, I'm from the Innocence Project. And he goes, who are you here to see? And she goes, Dennis Maher. He goes, it's about time. If anybody in here is innocent, it's Dennis. So, and then Elisa comes in and says, well, we're going to start the process of looking for evidence and see what we can find. So they start looking at Cambridge Courthouse for evidence, and Karen Burns is going down there by herself, and she's running into stone walls. The clerks are telling her, oh, the evidence has been destroyed. She says, well, do you have any records? And they say, no. Well, have you looked for the evidence? No. And she got fed up and went knocking on doors asking for help. And she found a person to help her on their lunchtime. Who it is, I have no idea. And that person found the evidence, which was in the courthouse. And so they brought the evidence down to the police lab to conserve the chain of evidence. And they put it on a spectrograph, I believe it is, or something like that, to look for the presence of blood or semen. And she says there was a presence of blood or semen. So they were going to send the evidence to Dr. Blake. And she called me back and she says, well, now they're saying there is none. There is no presence of semen on the evidence. And she says, well, why aren't you disappointed? I says, I've been being disappointed for years and years and years. I said, everything I ever filed in the court was denied without a hearing. Excuse me. And nothing's ever been allowed. I says, tell me something good, and then you'll get a different reaction. So later on that year, this is 2002, it's probably August or September, they came and got me to take my blood to do a DNA test. That process involved me going to the health services unit with the state trooper, the DA, someone from the Attorney General's office, a bunch of lawyers, and they had me in a holding cell with like 8 other guys. They were all flipping out because they thought they were coming for them. And I says, don't worry, they're coming for me, they're taking my blood to do a DNA test. Then they all relaxed. And so, to follow the chain of command, they took pictures of them swabbing my mouth, they took pictures of them taking blood from me, and they gave the evidence to the state trooper to bring to the state police lab, so that the chain of evidence was preserved. And then they sent that to Dr. Blake in California. On Christmas Eve of 2002, the results came back and I was excluded. Now, what an exclusion means is that the DNA is not mine, but if the victim had had sex with her boyfriend the night before or something like that, it could be his. And so they had to go and see the victim. They went and saw the victim and she flipped out. You know, she couldn't talk or anything. So they had to go and visit her a second time. And she still couldn't talk, so they asked her if they had her permission to get the records from the hospital, which are records that the police don't have access to when it takes a court order to get them, unless the victim agrees to allow them. So she agreed to allow them. And it found out that the victim was a virgin, so I was exonerated. Now that would only get rid of the 20 to 30 year sentence. I still had a life sentence. 2 weeks after I was exonerated in Lowell, a slide shows up on Maher desk, who was the Middlesex County DA. Nobody knows where the slide came from, but it was from my case, in the Air case. And so they sent that to Cellmark Labs, and they still had evidence left over from the DNA they took from me and sent that there too. So on April Fool's Day, I get a phone call from my lawyer. She says, when do you want to go home? And I says, you're kidding, right? She says, no. The DNA came back and it was 2 different DNAs and neither one of them was yours. So I says, well, not tomorrow because my parents are going to need time to prepare for this. So I says, how about Thursday, April 3rd? She says, okay, we can do that. So I walked into the courtroom. Martha Coakley was there, my lawyer was there. And as Martha Coakley was saying, all you have to do is sign the paper, Your Honor, he had a smile on his face saying, okay. And he says, I'm signing the paper. And then they released me. And you've seen that. That was in the movie. Jay Carney apologized to me. He was the DA that prosecuted me. Now that apology went a long ways for me being able to get my life back together. Very few exonerees have gotten a DA apology from the DA's office or from the person that prosecuted him. He still gets harassed by his colleagues because he apologized. He's a private attorney now. And he also told me that if I wouldn't have accepted his apology, he may have quit being an attorney because it had such an impact on him. And then 2 months after I got out, I met Mark in May of 2003, or June of 2003, and they started filming after Innocence. And I'll leave it at that.
because I do want to talk a bit about this program, but just one more thing. So that was your first child, then you had a second child. And what's the name of that child and why?
Her name's Eliza. She's named after the attorney who got me out there.
Full name.
Eliza Karen Lucy. Karen is the student who worked on the case. And Lucy's name.
So it's interesting where I am right now because this program today, it's really sort of the bookend of why I was able to do that, to do this film. You know, I worked in the Innocence Project as a law student when I was in law school. Everything about it, it was first of all a large reason why I went to Cardozo, because I couldn't believe that there was this program that existed that I could work on as a student. And everything about it was just so cinematic and monumental. I mean, my first day of class, literally, I don't think this will ever happen again in the history of the Innocence Project. Barry Scheck walked in and said, we didn't plan the curriculum like this, but there is someone who was just exonerated in New York today, and he's coming to the classroom. That was my first day of class. I mean, it was unbelievable. And just in the class during the 2 semesters, I couldn't believe that every other student didn't have an idea to write a book or do something to get this out there to the world, because it was just so impactful. And so bringing it back to Dennis, I was a student here and I was meeting individuals like Dennis or like Herman Atkins in the film, who was one of the first exonerees who I met, who were getting out and they were coming to the Innocence Project and meeting us. And their perseverance and their strength was literally heroic. I mean, I just couldn't imagine. I think of myself as a strong person, but this was something I just couldn't imagine the strength to get through. So I was very clear while I was a student that when I graduated I had to do something about this issue. And I had experience in the film business and believe that the medium of film is a great way to reach people because A, it continues. And my hope was that if I made this project, that, you know, I use this expression a lot, that it's, you know, dropping a pebble in the water and you do your best and then you kind of turn it out to the public and hope that those ripples continue. And so then bringing folks like Dennis to how I was able to do this and my motivation for doing it, and then to turn it to Larry and Bob. The truth is, now this film has been living in the public's eye for a long time. We premiered it, not a long time, but it premiered in Sundance in '05. And there's been some really great events surrounding it to do public awareness and things like that. But this, I really do consider a really special and important event in that there's several days committed to this issue, to bring people from law enforcement, to bring exonerees, to bring attorneys, and art, and to really affect people over the course of a few days is all I could hope for, because that's the next group of people taking what I did and now bringing it to another population. That's all I could hope, because that's how we get the change. It's dropping it in and then hoping the ripples happen. And so I thank you for doing this, really. And it does have effect. We learned that New Mexico passed compensation legislation because the legislator there had watched this film. I was just reading my binder about someone who gives to the Innocence Project because they saw this film. And so, and she's going to speak later, and I just introduced her, so I don't know her name, but there's someone here, and I really do invite you to speak shortly, whose son will hopefully become the next exoneree in New York State. And she, now I'm losing my train of thought because I was just thinking about that. She didn't know that this film is available on DVD, and so I'll take this time to say it absolutely is. It's available for purchase on Amazon.com. You can rent it on Netflix. And the point is, with this group of people, if you talk about this issue, and people within New York and out of New York, that's how change happens. And to me, what is change? The system will never be perfect. It's human, so it's not going to be perfect, but we can improve it. And that's a big part
what the Innocence Project's initiative is now. It's to reduce the occurrence of wrongful conviction and to help improve the lives of those who have been exonerated. And that's my goal with this film. When I was a student in the Innocence Project in 99-2000, what was most shocking to me was that we, far more than 50%, I would say the majority of the time, and it's slightly better now, but not 100% by any means, we would face resistance just in getting the DNA testing done. For that issue of closure that came up in the film that DA said. But for me, it was very clear that if you had a DNA test, you either confirmed guilt, which is a good thing, you have the right person in prison, or you exonerate the wrongfully convicted, and then have a chance to go out and get the actual perpetrator. And there's still resistance to that on this issue today. And that's what kills me. And I'll tell you, I used to not talk about it a lot when the film was first out, but when I was in the Innocence Project, it's really difficult, as you now know, to get to the testing stage. You have to find the evidence. You have to persuade these people who don't want to find the evidence that it might still be there. Then you have to go through these legal hurdles that I'm talking about, the resistance to get the testing, and hopefully you get to the testing. And the one case that I had was someone who was guilty, and he lied to us. And I said to him that we would know, and a few weeks before the testing was expected back, he said something to me that was we knew it. He said something like, "Oh, I hope they don't, screw around with me like they've been screwing with me." And I said, "What are you talking about? We said that this is, essentially, it's concrete. We're going to know whether you're guilty or you're innocent." And he started making excuses. I walked into Barry's office, and we both knew where the test was going to come back. And sure enough, he was guilty. But in a way, that's success. We just proved that the system worked. And let's now move on to find someone who's innocent. So to me, and I've always talked about this since the film came out, that this is not a black or white issue. It's not a red or blue issue. It's an issue of morality, and it's an issue of, improving a system to the best of our ability, because it really can happen to anyone, and it does, and it's our obligation as citizens. So, bringing this full circle, I'm very pleased that you're all here to talk about these important issues.
Thank you, Mark. When we planned this program, we wanted to have someone from law enforcement here, and Michael Paluzza, who's our Chief Assistant District Attorney and also was on our committee, suggested that we get someone from the New York State Police, from Troop D, and he called me a few days later and said we have a wonderful representative of the New York State Police, Captain Frank, well, he told me Francis Coots. Francis corrected me, not corrected me, but he calls himself Frank Coots. Captain Coots is with Troop D of the New York State Police. I'm not going to go into a lot of his biography, except that to say that in the year 2006, he won the Shining Star Individual Award by SABA here in the area, and has been very active in speaking out and also working with children in our district. With that, let me introduce Frank Cruz.
Thank you. It's kind of interesting that they have me follow that. Thanks a lot. They're a boring cop, But I was listening to Dennis, and try not to make it about me because it's about you. But we have very similar lives. And I graduated from high school in '79 in Framingham, Massachusetts, which is not that far from where Dennis grew up. That's where our lives diverged at that point. I went on to college, and when I was 23, was it 23 when you were arrested? I was chasing girls and drinking beer, and here he is in trouble. And it just really, it makes you reflect upon how lucky we all are. And I think the point I'm trying to make, and I do have another comment on this, but the point I'm trying to make is that as citizens of New York State and as of the country, we truly should be outraged that we allow people to go to jail that are innocent. And it's all of our responsibilities, as you said. It's all of, as a citizen, it's our responsibilities to ensure that, first of all, the innocent are not convicted wrongfully. And secondly, in the event that they are, and I can't remember who said that the movie said 150 were exonerated, and we're up to 223, and hopefully a lot more. Hopefully it's not going to be a lot more, because it shouldn't be a lot more. We shouldn't be finding innocent people in jail. But in the event that we have to, and I know that we have to, we'll continue with work such as this. And the second comment that what I'd like to make is the state police has a long history in criminal justice. We just celebrated our 92nd year in existence. And I've been a member of the state police for 25 of those years. And I was always very proud of being a member of the state police, and I still am. And one of the things that I would always tell people that I would arrest back when I was a real police officer, that I don't arrest innocent people, I only arrest guilty people. I knew that. You know, I could feel that in my bones that everyone that I arrested, I knew was guilty for which I arrested them for. But then 1992 came, and we had a bunch of people, and I say a bunch, it was 3 or 4 people that fabricated evidence, and we sent people to jail. There's one woman we sent to jail, that was after we killed her son. And and that's a separate issue, but the fact is that we shot and killed him, and then we fabricated evidence and we put her in prison. And it's when you're in situations like that, the public looks at it. It looks at the person who's being accused as not a very compassionate victim. They say she or he probably got what they deserved because of what happened. Or if they didn't get found guilty this time, it was probably for something they did before they should have been found guilty. So the one thing that the police can do, and that's to hire good people, good, strong, honest, with integrity people. And if we don't, we're going to have situations that we had in 1992 that truly that ruined our reputation in the public. We had a long ways. We had a really, really deep hole to dig ourselves out of. I think we've done that, but every now and then it does come and bite us in the rear end. And I just want to say thank you very much. And it was really, really an inspirational story. Thank you again.
Our next guest actually was secured for us by Liz Cesari, who's another member of our committee. Liz is an intern. She's sitting over here. She's an intern, a law student at Syracuse University. And when we started talking about putting together a panel, I said we really ought to have someone from one of the law schools, and she said, I know just the person. And within a matter of days, she had emailed me that Professor Sanjay Shablani had agreed to be just that person. I'm trying to keep my introduction short because I'm not the one you want to hear, but I just want to read you one short thing. There is a movie out called Fighting for Life in the Death Belt. And it's a gripping movie about the scene. It's about a lawyer fighting to save a wrongly convicted client from execution. And in the review about the movie, it says, there's a paragraph that says, Fighting for Life in the Death Belt profiles Stephen Bright, a seasoned veteran, and his young apprentice, Sanjay Shablani, who has traded a 6-figure salary for the opportunity to defend his first death row client. As these lawyers fight desperately against the system from within it, viewers come to understand their eloquent case against the death penalty. I introduce Dr. Shablani.
Thank you very much for having me here. And I want to second everyone's comments about the film. In particular, it struck me, it reminded me of my moral obligation to do something anew about this issue. And that's because what we saw transpired was not just an error by the prosecutor or the police, it was in all our names. Each of those prosecutions was by the people of the state in which the crime occurred. And in New York State, for each of the exonerations, it's been done in each of our names, all the misconduct. So each of us have an obligation in some small way to help correct the mistakes. And I'm grateful for this opportunity and this film because one of the things we can do is simply bear witness to what has been done in our name. And you're here to watch the film, and if you talk to your friends, your neighbors about the film, we do our bit. The second point I want to make is that there's a danger in believing that because we've been able to exonerate some people that the system worked. that it may be late, but at the end of the day, we catch all the innocent people and we save them. And I think that's not true. We saw thousands of letters in the Innocence Project's folders, but more than that, there are instances where simply DNA is not available. DNA is only available in a tiny fraction of all cases, and so there's no real way of proving innocence in the same way in 90% of other criminal convictions. In the film, there was a clip of Governor George Ryan from Illinois, who commuted the death sentences of everyone in Illinois. He was a death penalty supporter when he did that. And one of the cases that moved him to do that was the case of Anthony Porter, who had lost every single appeal he had and was weeks away from execution. He had lost every appeal. His lawyers filed what is pretty clear sort of a frivolous appeal, and the Illinois Supreme Court gave him a 6-month stay. And in that 6-month stay, there were 4 undergraduate students at Northwestern University who, as part of their journalism class, went out and investigated this crime, found out that Anthony Porter was innocent, found who the actual killer was, and had a videotaped confession. He was found innocent not because of anything the lawyers did, the police did, the prosecutor did, the judge did. The legal system failed Anthony Porter. It was 4 undergraduate journalism students as part of that class that saved his life. So that word of caution is that we ought not to consider that the system works in its finality. This movie ought to remind us of canaries in the mine shaft. There's something seriously wrong, and we need to address it. The last point I want to make is to just talk briefly about what are some of the causes of wrongful convictions. And as the movie touches, pretty importantly, one category of causes are evidentiary problems, eyewitness identifications, testimony by snitches, and forensic evidence. And by forensic evidence, we mean not only evidence that was incorrect. For example, in Texas, Cameron Willingham has been executed for arson. He was charged with killing his children, and he proclaimed his innocence all through the time of his execution. And the key piece of evidence used to convict him was forensic evidence of crazed glass. And that is a sort of, arson investigators had the theory that if you use an accelerant to start a fire, then the glass shows particular patterns in how it breaks up. And that was the evidence used to convict him, and that led to his execution. And we now know that that theory is false. That crazed glass occurs even in naturally occurring fires of natural origin. So there is forensic evidence that is used that may either be a bad theory or that may just have bad applications. You all have heard of Brandon Mayfield's case in Oregon. He was the attorney who was charged with being part of the Madrid bombings, the bombings that happened in Spain. And the FBI said they were 100% sure that he was guilty. Not 99%, not 98%, 100% sure he was guilty based on fingerprint evidence. Now, fingerprint evidence is very reliable, generally speaking. And that's what the FBI relied on, despite the fact that the Spanish investigators had concerns. And it turned out that that information was wrong, that they were basing it on fragments of the fingerprint, not the whole fingerprint. And it was clear that they had the wrong person. So there's wrongful forensic evidence. But besides that category which was shown in the film, the other category that contributes to wrongful convictions is misconduct. Misconduct, as you mentioned, sometimes the police engage in, and sometimes with the best of intentions, because they think they have the right person, and you want to do everything you can to get a conviction, and you don't have faith that the system will work. And so you cross lines that you ought not to cross. And in Chicago, Detective Burge, you saw a picture of Patterson, Anthony Patterson, in that clip on Lakeshore Drive. He's unfortunately now back in prison for another crime. But in his case, he had a confession. And he claimed that the confession had been tortured out of him. And we know it was because he had a paper clip in his hand, and he, while his hands were shackled, carved into the bench, "I am being tortured." And we now know that Detective Burge engaged in a long pattern of torture, and he has now been arrested by the U.S. Attorney's Office. in Chicago and is being prosecuted for torture. So there's some misconduct by police, there's misconduct by prosecutors. Here in upstate New York, we had an example of where the perpetrators of the crime were white, and the DA was prosecuting an African-American defendant and hid the evidence that the perpetrators were white. So there's misconduct, and then there's attorney error that contributes to it. I'll just end with this. My client, who was executed in Georgia, his lawyers made not one objection at trial, in a 2-day trial. They didn't do any independent investigation. Part of his claim was that the gun had misfired in the case, and they didn't present any evidence to the contrary, even though the gun had been recalled for accidental discharge. So there are many contributors to wrongful conviction, and I'm grateful for the film and for Dennis Maher's presence here to alert us to the fact that we have a systematic problem in the criminal justice system. Thank you.
I'm going to circulate among you for questions. As one question is finishing, I'll take the mic back and wave me down, and I'll find you for a second question. Let's start right here. Ma'am?
My question is concerning the Florida case. You have a judge and you have attorneys that kept this man in jail for 4 or 5 years after his date. What's going to happen to those people? I feel that they have violated some ethic law. Is the Bar Association, is anyone going to look into those people that kept him in jail for the additional 4 years?
I can talk specifically, and Ken, you speak more systematically on the issues. No, there is throughout the country immunity in the courtroom for advocates, which has some sense for that limited purpose, but just more from a academic point of view. If you want to talk about that, or if we just stay right here.
What I'd like to, the Chicago Tribune did a wonderful series about prosecutorial misconduct in homicide cases about 3 years or 4 years ago. And what they found out was that even in cases where the prosecutors engaged in deliberate misconduct, such as calling hog's blood human blood or red paint human blood, in not a single case across the country, and they looked at over 300 cases, not one case was the prosecutor in any way disciplined. There's never been a case. And in some cases, the records are sealed, so it's hard to know, but there's not been one case. And what they found even more troubling than that was that in many cases it led to promotion. And that prosecutors who had engaged in this conduct had been promoted, for example, in New Mexico, to the head of the authority that investigates complaints against prosecutors. That was the position that they were elevated to.
So then you're saying to me that the prosecution is above the law, or is above reprimand, so therefore they can do anything they want anytime they want. Is that what I'm hearing?
Well, if I can comment, I don't think he's necessarily saying that. There is certainly a large hurdle to go when it comes to prosecuting anybody that is being accused of misconduct during a trial. But one of the big things in New York State that we have is the citizens have the final say because they can vote them out of office. Again, not that it's the same as going to jail, and I'm not making the same comparison, but we do have the final say when it comes to re-election time. And getting back to the instance where I brought up back in '92 where we fabricated evidence, the prosecutor, not that he knew about it, but he was held accountable by the voters, and he was voted out of office.
Why would you have a bar association if nothing is done to someone that is doing something that is ethically incorrect? What does the bar association have to do with?
Well, the Bar Association and actually the courts have a procedure whereby anyone can file a grievance against a lawyer that they feel is engaged in misconduct. And there is a procedure, and a grievance is filed with the local Bar Association, depending on the seriousness or severity of the grievance that's being alleged. It gets sent up in our area to the 5th Department, which is a grievance committee under the jurisdiction of the 4th Department Appellate Division. And you do read on a regular basis of lawyers who have engaged in misconduct being disbarred or suspended. So there is a procedure, and it's just a question of following that procedure.
An example of just sort of on its face, obvious misconduct, but there was a lot of political influence in that case, was the Duke lacrosse, rape case that prosecutor is no longer, right, he got disbarred. But of course there was a lot of political influence there. The difference between something like that and what we saw in the film is the same obstacle that the exonerees have in getting compensated. You really have to prove actual malice, some level of that. It's hard to prove.
Underlying most of the debate and film and all the ideas presented, there is a presumption of innocence that must be understood in this country. We tend to, in our justice system, look at the accused as guilty, and it's wrong. We have to definitely look at the person who's being brought before our justice system. He's innocent until you prove him guilty. And the proof is difficult. It's difficult because it requires a lot of insight, a lot of careful planning. I wonder if the appellate system in this country is really working. And I like your comment concerning that.
Anyone jump in right there?
Well, I can speak on some of that because I've been through the appeal system. When I was first arrested, I felt I was guilty till proven innocent, without a doubt. Took me 19 years, but it was done. As I went through the appeal process, they kept saying, well, if it wasn't done in the lower courts, then it's a non-appealable issue. And then when it gets to the judge thought I was guilty, so he wouldn't allow anything I put in front of him. And so it just worked its way up, where one just agrees with what the other one says. Like, I believe there was a legal search and seizure, but it wasn't raised on my first appeal because the attorney wouldn't raise it, so I didn't have a chance to re-raise it again. And because they said because it wasn't raised on appeal, you lose that chance. And sometimes that's the way they can circumvent something, but I don't know exactly how it all works. But that's what happened to me. I filed Rule 30s, I filed all kinds of motions, I filed the habeas corpus, and everything I ever filed got denied. Every time they appealed something, it got denied. And that's how I seen that process work, the wrong way.
Was there justification for the rejection? Did they offer you evidence why they rejected your appeal?
No, they don't have to. They're judges. I'm sorry. That's the way I feel about it.
We have a question right here.
Since we happen to have present someone from the state police and from the district attorney's office, I'm wondering if you would consider committing to showing this film to people training in your departments, to deputy district attorneys and to police officers, both at the state level and the more local level.
I think it's a fair request. Certainly I'm not at that level within the state police that I can make a commitment like that, but I certainly can take your wishes forward, and I don't think it's an unreasonable request on your part, or anyone's part.
And I can tell you that right up to the district attorney, who's participated in a previous forum held earlier this year, we are all very conscious of these issues, and absolutely this film will be shown to everyone in the district attorney's office.
Thank you, that's Michael Kaluza, part of our Innocence Committee and First Assistant District Attorney for Oneida County. I have a question right here.
My name is Sylvia Barnes, and I'm the person that the producer Mark Simon has talked about. My son Stephen Barnes has done 19 years, 5 months, and 5 days for a murder he did not commit. I've never been ashamed of my son, but I'm horribly ashamed of our judicial system. It's very broken, it needs to be fixed. Cops should not be able to lie. They should not depend on jailhouse snitches. We are grateful that the district attorney in Oneida County has released my son's evidence. It's now in DNA testing, and we hopefully my son will be the next person exonerated. I congratulate you on your exoneration.
Is DNA testing now mandatory in like rape cases and murder and so on? So now
But again, if you don't do it, you have to explain why you didn't do it, so it makes it part of an exculpatory process of the defense.
And just on the flip side of that, he's talking about the prosecutorial aspect of it. In terms of post-conviction access to DNA, 8 years ago when I was in the Innocence Project, the majority of states did not have laws allowing for DNA testing. And now it's certainly the majority, and it may be in the 40s of the 50 states now.
44.
Yeah.
There's only 6 states that don't allow DNA testing.
So that's a positive.
I'm going to let the assistant district attorney weigh in on that, and then I'll come back to your questions.
In answer to the audience member's question, it is not required in any particular criminal case, let's say in a homicide case, that any specific DNA tests be performed. I can tell you as a prosecutor that we don't always have DNA to work with. It all depends on the circumstances of the case. You may have a shooting on the street where there is no weapon recovered, where the assailant gets away. There is nothing left to test for DNA. Fingerprints, it's a common misconception, for example, that fingerprints are left at every crime scene. That's simply not the case. In the overwhelming majority of cases, we don't have fingerprints to work with. One of the things that prosecutors are conscious of with juries is something called the CSI effect. That is, all of these shows that are on now that solve all these cases by forensic evidence. The truth is that there is a certain percentage of cases that rely on forensic evidence, but not by a long stretch the overwhelming number of cases. However, when we do have materials that may yield results, we test. We submit them to the State Police Crime Lab. We have an excellent working relationship with them. They are a group of very dedicated, highly ethical individuals, I must say. The area of forensic testing has come along in light years over the last 10 or 15 years. When I started in 1991, and maybe even a little before that, in order to get DNA results, you needed a drop of blood the size of a dime. That's no longer the case. You can now get DNA from casual contact, where someone sweats, from somebody drooling or having spittle on something, sometimes even just from touching something. So one of the benefits of DNA is that it allows for people to go back and have their evidence examined. And in some cases, exonerations take place, and grave miscarriages of justice are righted. We can't give back to these wrongfully convicted people those years of their lives that they've lost. It's nothing short of tragic. But we can be ever conscious of the responsibility of full disclosure and to maintain the highest ethical standards in the way you discharge your duty, whether you're a police officer, a prosecutor, or a defense attorney, or a judge. And that's why I think programs like this are just so very beneficial.
As far as the states go, with passing laws to allow DNA testing, I went up to Maine and I testified at their state house and got them to change their law from the way it was. It used to be that the person requesting DNA testing had to find the person who committed the crime to get the DNA testing done to prove their innocence. Well, we helped, me and my brother went up there, my brother John's up the top, and we went up in Maine, changed their laws to allow people ready access to DNA testing. And then I also went up to Vermont to testify to their state legislature, and they wrote one of the best DNA laws in the country. They have, they're open to testing. They went and changed witness identification to a double-blind system, and they changed different other aspects of it, and they also gave compensation. Now, Massachusetts doesn't have a DNA law. I ended up doing 6 extra years in prison because of the judge who didn't allow the DNA testing. And I can't wait for this.
Can I ask a question? Sure. What is New York's position on interrogation videotaping? 'Cause I don't know the answer to that. And also, you just referred to the double blind. How do we deal with lineups in New York?
I'll let Mike talk about the lineups, but on the first part of the question, the video New York State does not require any type of confession to be videotaped. I know that Scott McNamara is way ahead of the curve here in Oneida County, that he's working on a policy to start off slowly and hopefully get at least felony confessions on videotape. As we stand right now, there is no state mandate that anything videotape. No confessions at all.
Interesting, if I can make a comment, in New York State there have been 23 exonerations through the Innocence Project. In 10 of those, the exonerations were people who had given false confessions. And one of the reforms that the Innocence Project is seeking from our legislature, and Assemblywoman Roanne Testito, when she was here on Wednesday, talked about a bill that's pending with regard to that, was mandating videotaping of confessions. If a jury can actually see the process of interrogation, they can form their own judgment as to whether or not the person is confessing, whether the person is being put under some kind of stress, whether the person has been held up or kept awake for 24 hours, or whether, in some cases, the police officer who comes in and says, we didn't record this, but this is what he said, whether that is in fact a confession. So the Innocence Project is seeking reforms in that area. They're also seeking reforms with regard to double-blind lineups, which will certainly improve the process by which misidentifications occur at this point.
I'm going to give the mic back to Michael Kaluza in just a second so he can address your question about Oneida County specifics, but I want to get this gentleman's question first.
I don't know how to use one of these things. I was just wondering if the system requires success, that prosecutors have to be successful, otherwise there won't be prosecutors. And policemen have to make arrests and get convictions. Is there too much pressure in that way?
I think that it depends on the case. Is there any legal requirements? If there's any legal requirements mandating that we get so many convictions or so many arrests, no. As a matter of fact, New York state law prevents us from being evaluated in that type of world. But on the other side of it is you certainly don't want someone that's not working. And one of the categories that we can show someone's working is that they've arrested people. So, you know, there's a fine line that we're walking there, of course, that we just don't want somebody working, and all they're doing is arresting people willy-nilly. But we certainly want them working hard. We want bad guys arrested.
We don't want a prosecutor who loses all his cases either.
No.
Well, you certainly want a prosecutor that's competent, you want a prosecutor that's aggressive, but you want a prosecutor that's also ethical.
I would submit to the gentleman that the problem with a prosecutor who loses all of his cases is that he is obviously not evaluating his cases properly or not presenting them properly. I suppose it's theoretically possible that a person who loses 20 cases in a row, loses in the sense that he gets a not guilty verdict, was prosecuting 20 innocent people. However, if I saw that kind of statistic among a prosecutor that's under my supervision, I would have to ask myself how he's doing his job, how he's evaluating his cases, how he's presenting his evidence. Ultimately, it is in the hands of the jury, and juries are instructed that the people are not looking for any particular outcome in the case. Juries are told that. The prosecutor's ethical requirement is not that he seek convictions in every case, but that he seek justice in every case. And if a prosecutor is losing case after case after case, generally there's something wrong with the way that person is discharging their duty. Either they're not preparing correctly, or they're not evaluating the evidence correctly, or they're seeking indictments in cases where they shouldn't seek indictments, where the evidence is not sufficient to warrant going forward with a criminal charge. So, sure, we don't want to see prosecutors losing case after case after case, but by the same token, we do want prosecutors to be ethical and to always remember that their job first is to seek justice.
Regarding these cases where there has been exoneration of the one who was convicted, has there been any studies made regarding the competency of the attorneys who represented these persons? I know Mr. Schreck, I think he was going to, he's brought that up several times in interviews. I wonder if any studies have been made. You know, the doctors have peer reviews. I mean, lawyers have peer reviews of any kind, you know, to judge the competency of various attorneys. I guess that's two questions, but more just the first one.
I mean, very specifically, when we were talking about what are some of the causes of wrongful conviction, there's no doubt that there's a category on the Innocence Project website called bad lawyering, and it literally means that. I mean, Dennis can speak very eloquently, unfortunately, on this subject. But, you know, with some of the legal aid offices that don't have the resources or that don't have legal aid offices, bad representation is absolutely a cause of wrongful conviction. And, you know,
Well, the lawyer who represented me was disbarred for a year right after my trial, and then within that year he got disbarred for life. Because the first disbarment was for soliciting, I guess. He walked up to my parents and asked them if they needed a lawyer. And I guess an attorney cannot do that in Massachusetts. And the second part, he was embezzling from his people he was representing.
But the point is, he wasn't disbarred for incompetency in representing, you know, criminal defendants. And I think most of the lawyers in New York State who are disbarred are usually for, you know, estate things, or, you know, but you very rarely hear them being disbarred for incompetency in criminal trials.
As we think about that, part of the problem is not just the application of the lawyer in that case. It goes all the way up to the Supreme Court, and the standard that the Supreme Court has created for proving that your lawyer was ineffective. Not only does the defendant have to show that the lawyer did something that was unreasonable, but the burden is on the defendant to show that that would have made a difference at trial. If the defendant cannot show a different, good likelihood of acquittal, then it doesn't matter what the lawyer did. And so we've had instances of lawyers, in the Fifth Circuit, the lawyer slept through part of the trial, and the appellate court said, there is no error, because we don't know what part of the trial the lawyer slept through. It could have been a less important part of the trial. And the burden was on the defendant to show what part of the trial. So I think we have to look at not only the application, but also the regime, the legal regime that the court has created.
Ineffective assistance to counsel is one of the hardest things to prove. You know, my friend's lawyer was drunk, didn't show up, but that wasn't enough to get him to trial.
Do you still have a question?
One of the disturbing underlying issues in your film is that it seems that we've accepted that the affluent will be well defended and the indigent will not be. Is this a future project, or is it a current project for the Innocence Project?
You know, not specifically, not that I'm aware of, but I think, you know, it's just unfortunately a fact that those with means have access to better counsel very often. You know, I don't.
Anyone else want to speak about that?
Well, I will say that the Bar Association does have a pro bono program. They do have some counsel programs, and we're always looking to have our public defenders' offices improved. But it oftentimes boils down to the lack of funds, and I would agree with you that if you have the money to pay for a top-notch lawyer, you're more likely to do well than if you pick someone else.
You also have to look at the workload that the public defender's office has. You know, you may have one lawyer with 30 or 40 cases. You know, how much time can you devote to each case?
I think it's also important to note that at this time, and as far as I know, throughout their history, the work of the Innocence Project has been offered at no charge to the people they help exonerate. Most of their funding comes from donations, fundraising events, and other support areas, and they charge nothing for the information that the assistance they provide to the exonerees.
I have
will the Innocence Project become involved before conviction?
No, I mean, there are organizations that do the Innocence Project is focused on post-conviction and reform, but they will not be taking on cases prior to conviction.
Can you lead in a direction to these organizations?
I can think of if you guys. I mean, it's really very often like the legal aid offices and investigating, but groups that take on cases.
No, I think it's simply a question of numbers. There is too many cases prior to trial to provide those services in all cases. That's probably the most efficient thing to do, but we don't have the resources. And that feeds back to your previous question about the lawyers. That is the single biggest failing in these cases is the quality of lawyering. If you have a good lawyer, not necessarily a private lawyer, even some public defenders, a good lawyer, your chances are much more enhanced. If you have a poor lawyer, you are in trouble. And so there are cases all across now in the South, and even up here in New York State, a lawsuit has been filed by the ACLU to require that we have a public defender system statewide where you have specialized attorneys over time who develop the skills in these cases. So that's something that's being litigated.
And I think part of our question, outside of the public defender system, are there organizations that take on cases, prior to trial kind of thing?
Well, no, what I'm looking at, okay, where there's already 2 organizations that have picked it up. They're not local. One's Justice for Juveniles and the other is the Defense Foundation. And when I came here today, there was a lot of questions. They were both telling me to ask as far as more support, looking for like local support in Central New York.
Bar Association.
There's
Probably
the
called Bar Association.
Bar Association offers for counseling advice. No, there.
Well, I'm sorry. The Bar Association would be able to steer you to an attorney, but we would not be able to provide legal services. Is that?
No, I'm not actually looking for legal services. Where he already has an attorney, these 2 organizations are doing more as far as looking into all the evidence, which there is no evidence, and looking over the case and making sure that the attorney is going in the right direction, and they've contacted the attorney, and there's been a lot of different, like paralegals and attorneys that have contacted his attorney to make sure everything is being done correctly because of the situation, to make sure nothing's being overlooked. But these organizations aren't like right here where I can get in the car and drive to their office.
What type of organizations are they? Are they legal aid type organizations?
No. One of them was called Justice for Juveniles.
Okay.
And the other one's called There's Miracle Homes. And this all has to do with a juvenile being charged. There's the Defense Foundation. There's numerous organizations that have all gotten involved, but none of them, again, are from Central New York.
Okay, I think I do know the case that you're referring to, and I'd be happy to talk to you later about some other possibilities that you might be able to explore.
Great. Larry, I think I'd like to take one last question and allow each of our guests to make a final statement before we close things up.
My question is, what is the reasoning behind, after you found someone innocent, the courts will not clear the record of that person? What is the reasoning behind it? I do not see one.
You're talking about Vincent Moto. There hasn't been, no court is saying there's a reason not to do it. In the case of Vincent Moto, my example is that it's sort of like a bad day at the DMV. No one is saying that his record shouldn't be expunged. It's just that at the time of his exoneration, the system in Pennsylvania wasn't set up for exonerations, and they didn't have a method to go back and get rid of his convictions. And believe it or not, it hasn't been easy for him to do it. He needed to get represented to go through the mechanics of having it done. And as of today, he still hasn't had his record expunged. It's just, but no one is opposing it. It just hasn't happened. And that's not across the board, but it certainly is in his case, and is still, as far as I know, his record is still not expunged.
Now, is that for all states or?
No.
In Massachusetts, an exoneree can get his record expunged. Mine hasn't been expunged yet because to do that, I have to drop my lawsuits so that they can take everything out of the courts. I told them I can wait till after the lawsuits are over. You know, and then I'll get my record expunged. Because they have to take everything out of the court and out of the whole system.
Thank you.
There have been some that have had their records expunged, but it's a lot of work on the part of the court system. And I think it gets expunged through the police too.
To the courts, and the courts mandate us expunge our records.
I want to thank all of the panelists for participating this afternoon, but especially I want to thank Dennis and Mark for making the trip from Massachusetts and New York City. And I do want to just make one final statement, and that is, you know, a lot of the exonerees, after you've spent 10, 15, 20, 22 years in prison, you want to get on with your life and you want to put all of what happened before behind you. And I'm just so thrilled that people, a number of the exonerees, such as Dennis, have taken it upon themselves to go out there and speak to people and make the public aware of these imperfections in our system so that it doesn't happen to other people and so that they can help other people who are in prison wrongfully convicted. And for that work, and for dedicating his life the way he has, going from state assembly to state assembly and speaking around this part of the country, first of all, I'm absolutely proud and honored to be able to call him a friend, but in reality, Dennis is a hero, and I'd like to thank him for coming. All of you for coming in. If you want to, one of the things that you can do to help the cause is to encourage as many of your friends as you run into in the next couple hours to come to tonight's performance. Tonight will be the film again at 9 o'clock. What we have is Dennis and Mark will be speaking at 9 o'clock rather than a panel discussion, and there will be questions and answers and a reception after that. I encourage you all to encourage your friends. This has just been a moving experience for me, and I hope it has been for you. Thank you.
Thank you.